Hey guys, so today I'm going to talk about writing for flute, obviously from a flutist perspective and not a composer's perspective. Um, this was requested by Dissonance and Harmonies, and before I really get into it, I do have a video about the mechanics and like the technical side of the extended techniques. I'm not going to talk about that in this video. I'm happy to make a video about it again or expand on my original video, and I will link that one in the description. So yeah. Moving forward with the extended technique idea, you don't have to use them. And I know that seems obvious, but there seems to be a train of thought in the contemporary music world that it isn't new music if it doesn't use the new sounds. And that's not true. And any composer worth their salt will tell you that. It's all about your personal aesthetic and what you want to use. And if that requires lots of extended techniques, fine. If it requires none, great. It's all personal choice, and as long as it's done with intention, it isn't going to matter to the performer. That being said, intention is important. You can't just scatter them in there because you want to and you think that that's what you're supposed to be doing and have it work unless it's sheer luck. In which case, damn you. But it's... as long as you're doing it with thought and with intention, as I've said about 4 times, it shouldn't matter whether you use them or not. That being said, clarity is important. There are a lot of resources that have kind of codified the notation for these techniques. I talked about it in my first video about contemporary music. And I'm happy to talk about it again, as I said. But a lot of people still aren't using the standard notations, and there are a lot of sounds that are still being discovered or kind of modified, and there's ways to do everything that are... anything can be notated if you explain it properly, is basically what I'm trying to say. But you still have to explain it properly. The performer has to know what you want. And that's harder when you're making up the sounds on the spot or when you're using non-standard notation. So giving the performer clear instructions on what sounds are to be produced at certain points is super important, whether you literally just write a paragraph about how to do it. Like, if you have to and there's no other way to do it, just writing words is totally acceptable and it's pretty common practice at this point. I think also along the clarity lines is you have to realize that there's a very, very wide range of skill sets within the flute world, even within the professional flute world. There are people who are contemporary specialists. Like, give a score to Claire Chase, and she isn't gonna care what you notated half the time, or she'll straight up tell you that it's wrong. But if you give a score to someone who's never seen a contemporary score in their life, with all these extended notation and everything like that, they're going to be intimidated or they're not going to understand, and they're going to struggle mightily to get your point across. So clarity of the score is extremely important when you're giving it to a performer who doesn't do this regularly, which is 95% of the time who you're going to be working with, especially when you're in school. And I think a great example of someone who's been very successful in creating contemporary music with clarity to appeal to all audiences is Ian Clark. Granted, he is a flutist himself, so he does understand what he understands the instrument better than someone who doesn't play the instrument. But he's done a really, really great job of implementing contemporary techniques in a very inventive way and explaining them properly. And explaining them in a way that people who have never made those sounds in their lives can do them. And do them effectively. So those are the big things, quite honestly, because the technical facility of flute is limited in terms of range and in terms of, like, there's certain things that are physically impossible, but you probably won't realize it until you try it. But every flute player has a different skill set and a different weakness and strength, and so you won't really know until you get into the room and workshop with someone. And that's where workshopping is so, so important, is we know our instruments better than you guys do. It's just the truth. And getting someone to try your piece before you give it to the performer, or getting the performer to try it before you really give them the like final draft, can be so enlightening. And that's just because there are certain things that we can tell you are possible, but put them in a certain context and they will become impossible. Like, I've had so many people ask me, what's the max speed you can do this at? And I'm like, well, out of context, I can do it this fast. But if you put these things before it, I literally cannot do it anymore. Or if you ask me to play a super loud jet whistle, great, I can do that one off. If you ask me to play 10 of them in a row, I'm literally going to pass out. So there's certain things that you can ask as many questions as you want, but until you get into the room and show the player what exactly you want and what context these passages are in, you won't know whether it's possible or not. For me, I like seeing like the final rough draft. In the first time I see the piece, I like it to be kind of a finalized idea of what they want, because then I can help them get to the point that it's playable, but it's also still what they want. If I just see rougher sketches and earlier sketches, it's a lot harder because you can't see their intention as clearly. And I know every player is different, but for me at least, seeing the composer's intention and then be able to help them produce that with the flute knowledge is the most helpful for me. And I probably just touched on this, but there are limitations in terms of physical air. We'll break phrases when we have to breathe. We'll find that stuff. But there are certain things when you start manipulating air techniques that are just not possible. And jet whistle is probably the most important one to take note of, in that because of the way you produce a jet whistle, which is basically emptying the entire contents of your lungs over the course of a couple seconds, if you stack them on top of each other back to back, we will get dizzy. We will start having oxygen deprivation. I've seen people almost pass out because of them. So you have to be really careful. If you give the performer themselves the freedom to choose the frequency, we'll figure it out in a way that doesn't hurt us, hopefully, if they're smart performers, which I really hope they are. But the physical limits are a really important thing to note, and hurting your performer is something obviously to avoid. But I think, honestly, in terms of writing for flute, apart from taking note of the actual limitations of the instrument, which are readily accessible in textbooks and online, just talking to a performer and letting them give you an idea of what they can do. Especially if you're writing for that person, it's really perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable, and quite honestly encouraged to ask them, what do you do well? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What should I avoid? Because they know, they'll be perfectly happy to tell you, because they want a piece that shows them off. So yeah, I think that's kind of my basics for writing for flute, and they're super obvious once you start thinking about them, and quite honestly they are true for any instrument apart from some of the physical limits. But that's the reality of it, is writing for flute isn't much different than writing for any other instrument. We just play it differently. So I hope this was helpful in some way, and I will see you guys very soon, otherwise known as tomorrow, because the 365 is the thing.